Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 111th series of Social Science Baha lecture. My name is Suresh Dhaka. I teach anthropology at the Central Department of Anthropology, Durham University. So my major task today is to introduce our speaker to you. And I suppose that many of you have already sourced, read, heard of his works. And then basically as a format, the lecture will be for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have another 45 minutes for question and answer sessions. We'll come back to that later about the procedure of question and answer session. So today, the title of the talk is Migration and Development, Spring of Hopes or Winter of Despair. And Jonathan Rigg is our guest today. So Jonathan Rigg is a professor of human geography in the School of Geographical Sciences at the University of Bristol in the UK. Formerly, he was based at the National University of Singapore, where he was director of the Asian Research Institute, and Durham University and SOAS, both in the UK. His research engages with the questions of agrarian change in the Asian region, and he has worked since the early 1980s in Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka and Nepal. In 2022, he was elected a fellow of the British Academy. In his 40 years long, more than 40 years long research experiences, in addition to the question of agrarian change, he has extensively worked in various fields. So probably today's lecture is one of the prominent examples of that. Professor Rigg has authored several books, book chapters, and journal articles. Some of his recent works include More Than Rural, Texture of Thailand's Agrarian Transformations, which is published by Hawaii University Press in 2019, and Rural Development in Southeast Asia, Dispersion, Accumulations, and Persistence in 2020, published by Cambridge University Press, and co-author of the Routledge Handbook of Global Development in 2022. And as a general academic fashion nowadays, that you can just Google his name and you can see scores of articles, books, and book chapters that he has written. Even if it is my first time that I'm meeting Jonathan in person, But that's how I actually met Jonathan, virtually. That when I was working in the agrarian transformation in Nepal, and then the easiest way to type keywords like agrarian transformation and Asia, then you definitely meet Jonathan there. So that's how I actually met Jonathan a couple of years ago. About today's talk, drawing on fieldwork undertaken in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Nepal, the lecture will assess the limits of the study of migration for judging its development impacts, challenging the positive tendencies of multilateral agencies towards migration's effects and effect. This lecture places mobility within the structural context and development time. The conclusion is that fixing migration to achieve good change is necessarily impossible, because migration always reaches before and stretches beyond the process itself. So, as the title of the talk suggests, migration and development, spring of hopes or winter of despair, we as an audience presume that the migration outcome is not uniformly or equitably distributed to all concerned, which provoke us to question the monolithic description of migrations and its impact. Therefore, I personally too, eager to listen to Professor Rigg's thoughtful and nuanced approaches to the question of migrations and development. Also, I hope, among others, to hear his conceptual and methodological reflections on the study of migration and its outcomes, whose hopes and whose despairs. Jonathan? No, thank you.
Right, wonderful. Thanks, Suresh, for that generous introduction. Well, first of all, thank you to Deepak and Jeevan for inviting me. I have to be closer tonight. Right. And thank you all for coming on a Thursday evening. I think a lot better things to do than listen to me. But anyway, so first of all, I've got to provide a few excuses so that I get your disappointment in early. First of all, I'm not a Nepal specialist. I am working in Nepal and with several people in the room, rather to my horror. I see myself more as a Southeast Asianist, so I work, as you just heard. Started off in Thailand, then in Laos, more recently in Vietnam, a little bit in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and now Nepal. So what I find myself doing is sort of ground truthing what I see and hear in Nepal against what I have heard and seen in other places. So, I'll be interested to see your reflections afterwards, your comments and questions in terms of, in terms of whether I've captured things correctly when I've taken experiences from other places and brought them to Nepal. Hopefully this is going to be a reasonable blend of the theoretical and the empirical. I think we've got a mixed audience here. Some academics, some natural scientists, some social scientists, maybe some people who are not scholars at all and just interested. So I'll try and make sure that it's fairly broad in its reach. I hope that works. Right, the title, Spring of Hope or Winter of Despair, comes from Charles Dickens. Those of you who read Dickens, The Tale of Two Cities starts with a line not dissimilar to this, so it's not me. So Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and then it goes on, was it Spring of Hope or Winter of Despair? And I thought it was appropriate for this talk. So it's not my subtitle, it's Dickens. Last thing to say in introduction, I normally walk around, and obviously I can't today, I'm stuck here. I find walking helps me to think. So being here, I'm going to be kind of wanting to stand up all the time. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. Okay, I'll start with three kind of vignettes from earlier this week, actually. We've just come back from Dhoka, where we've been talking to rural households, many of them of whom have migration experiences. So I want to talk about, very briefly, 3 of those households, and then want to use those as a way of kind of reaching into broader debates about migration and development. So, first vignette, Anuradha and myself interviewed a 23-year-old single woman in this resettlement village here, and she'd come back home to her family from Kathmandu, where she's studying a BBA, and she said that she would really like to live in the village, but she had no choice if she was going to achieve her ambitions but go to Kathmandu. And she'd been away from the village, I think, for 5 years. Yeah, and she didn't see, although she wanted to return, she didn't see how that was possible given the distribution of opportunities across Nepal. Second vignette, we interviewed, Anuradha and I, myself again, a 33-year-old man with 2 young children, and he told us he had enough land to feed his family for about 2 months each year. And that meant that in order to sustain his family, keep them alive, give them a reasonable livelihood, he had to leave his village, his home, his household, and in fact he's working for a private sector electricity company as a manual worker, erecting cables, working on pylons and so forth. And I asked him, or I asked Anuradha to ask him, whether he thought of himself as a farmer or as a worker. And he said, well, I'd like to think of myself as a farmer, but I don't really farm very much. I can't afford the time. I have to go away in order to feed my family. And then right at the end, we interviewed the ward chair, 40-year-old man, and we asked him if there was one thing that would improve conditions in his ward more than anything else, what would it be? And he said, everyone to have a job and an income. He said that agriculture in this particular ward in Dhoka just didn't sustain livelihoods. So if he had a wish list, that would be the one thing that he would like to do. And I think all those 3 sort of observations, or 3 kind of vignettes of people's livelihood conditions, I think will thread their way through the next 40 minutes or so. Okay, now 3 provocations. Some of you will know this book by Amartya Sen, fantastic book from the early 80s, Poverty and Famines, in which he made the surprising observation that famines are not about a lack of food, that the food availability decline argument doesn't apply. Actually, in most famines, there's enough food. The problem is that people can't command the food that exists. Second provocation from scholars like, for example, Jesse Rebo, is that climate change vulnerability is not actually about the climate. We need to ask questions about the way in which adverse incorporation into, if you like, the capitalist system renders people vulnerable to climate change. And what I want to do this evening is suggest to you that the development outcomes of migration are not about migration. Actually, they're about other things. And therefore, if we're going to understand migration and what happens with migration, in a sense we have to look elsewhere. Yeah, the answers to why those vignettes that I provided, how migration insinuates its way into their lives, is not actually about mobility, it's about other factors. And that means that if we want to kind of fix, in inverted commas, migration, we need to fix development. Yeah. Migration is just the process through which we come to understand development. And I guess that sort of inset quote I have on the slide up there, that's in essence what this talk is about over the next, I said 40 minutes, it must be less than that now, 38 minutes. Okay, I think to situate this in kind of wider terms, it's worth just providing a little bit of background in terms of how scholars and practitioners have understood migration, so kind of bear with me for a short while. And I'm rather artificially dividing scholars and practitioners into two groups, what I call the migration optimists and the migration pessimists. Of course, a lot of people are somewhere between the two. Yeah, they don't fit neatly into one box or another, but for the purposes of this talk, I think it's useful. So first of all, the migration optimists. These are often people who work for multilateral organizations, I would say, UNDP, World Bank, so forth. They are often economists or at the kind of economic end of the social sciences, if you like. And I've got two quotes here that exemplify that position. So the World Bank, countries do not prosper without mobile people. Indeed, the ability of people to move seems to be a good gauge of their economic potential, and the willingness to migrate appears to be a measure of their desire for advancement. And then we have the migration pessimists. These are often Marxists, structuralists, post-structuralists, people who see migration emerging out of a series of changes to society and economy which deepen inequalities and force people to have to move from their homes in order to survive. So that first vignette, why is that young girl, that young woman in her 20s, got to leave Dhoka in order to achieve her aspirations, even though she does not wish to? She would prefer to live at home. How is it that rural-urban relations, farm-non-farm inequalities, why do they evolve in the way that they do? So, if you like, migration pessimists would understand her migration not as a search for a better life, which the migration optimists would do, but if you like, a displacement from a preferred life and lifestyle which comes out of processes of structural change. So the first one, I would say, the migration optimists, this is about individual capabilities. This is about us as individuals shaping our futures in a kind of positive way, deploying our labor, our social capital, our intellectual abilities, our skills, and finding the best paying work wherever it happens to be. Yeah, so we understand migration and why people move as a kind of positive outcome. The second one is more structural. Yeah, we ask questions about the structures in society, whether inherited, like, say, caste here in Nepal, or produced through processes of economic transition, capitalist transformation, and so forth. So, that's the sort of background. So I've got these two views. As I say, slightly artificial. Most people aren't clearly in one and clearly in the other. They're somewhere in the middle. But kind of, I think as I say, for the purposes of this discussion, hopefully useful. So, got another quote here from the UNDP. I'll just read the bits in shaded in yellow. For many people in developing countries, moving away from their hometown or village can be the best, sometimes the only option open to improve their life chances. I mean, that kind of encapsulates that first person I talked about, and the second for that matter, the young man with his 2 children. Migration makes not just them better off, but also the villages they leave and the cities in which they settle. So the argument here is migration is good for the migrant, it's good for his or her household, it's good for the community from which they originate, and it's good for the place they go to. You might call this a sort of quadruple win. Yeah, everyone is winning. It's win, 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 win. Yeah, that's the sort of view of, if you like, the optimists. And of course, if you take that view, then we should be in the business of reducing barriers to migration. We should be oiling the wheels of movement, greasing infrastructure so that people can get to where they want to go, both domestically, so within Nepal, but also internationally. Barriers to movement, whether it's people trying to cross the English Channel to get to the UK, or maybe people going to the Gulf from Singapore and across into India. we should be in the business of lowering barriers and trying to accentuate and amplify and encourage migration. And then because it's a win for everyone, we all benefit. Migrant household, migrant community, source, and also destination. Right, so now what I want to do is kind of sort of start to dig into that a little bit and see where I see it kind of frame. And I want to start by thinking about what is sometimes termed the left behind. So those people, like the young woman's family, who she left behind, like the man and his wife and 2 children who were left behind. So what happens when we start to connect the migrant with, if you like, the natal household? So, the argument, again, for the optimists, this is a UNDP, quite an influential UNDP report, says, moving generally brings benefits, most directly in the form of remittances. Benefits are also spread more broadly as remittances are spent. Women in particular may be liberated from traditional roles. So you see here in this sort of quote a sort of selective reading of migration. And I think in the process there are kind of 2 sleights of hand at work. First of all, that success is measured in quite narrow terms. Yeah, it's economic, it's remittances, it's money. Yeah, it's the flow of economic resources to the household and to the village. And thinking about sort of why is it that we restrict it in that way. And the second sleight of hand is the suggestion that things are, there's a kind of smooth process of kind of rippling through into the village, a spread of benefits, that the migrant, his or her work, the remittances that are generated, their flow back into the community, and then the way they seep more widely beyond the individual, the actual household, to other parts of the community's population. That sort of smooth sense. Is that the way it really works? Is the kind of question that I have in mind. So, what happens when, sort of paradoxically, we stop thinking of migration in terms of the migrant? What if we start to think about the non-migrant? I mean, it could be argued one of the problems of migration studies is it focuses too much on migration. Because of course, when a migrant leaves, she or he leaves people behind. And they are just as much part of the process as the person who moves. So if we're going to kind of get a full reading of migration, we need to sort of shift our view from the migrant to those who, if you like, permit migration to occur, who encourage it, who support it, who make it possible. And if we do that, then I think the things that we focus on change. And they change in 3 ways, and I've got them here. First of all, there's a shift from production to reproduction. So if you think of the second person I talked about from Dhoka, the man, his wife, and his 2 children. I mean, he left and went, often for long periods of time, to work with this private sector electricity company. But he leaves behind a wife and 2 children. If we think about them, we move away from his productive work and towards her reproductive work. And it's her reproductive work is just as much part of the migration equation as the work that he's doing for the electricity company. So in doing that, we then shift from those who work to those who support such work, and then we shift from economics to care. So we stop counting things in material terms, and particularly in terms of income and remittances, and start thinking about care work. So how we begin to judge migration begins to shift, because our object of analysis, our object of interest, is also shifting. I don't know if you can see this. It might be too small. I don't know. Can you see that at the back? Can you see it copied? Kind of? Yeah? Yeah, you can? Yep. Okay, this is a household I interviewed in Thailand, I think in 2015, something like that, 2016. And I don't know if you can read it, but sort of within the blue circle are those who are in the village. And it's an elderly couple, a sort of grandfather and grandmother, and also they're raising one of their grandchildren. Everyone else is outside the village, working in other activities outside agriculture, in other towns, doing different things, but they're all connected back to the natal village. They're remitting money, they're coming back to work at key points in the agricultural cycle. Yeah, they're part, functional terms, of the household, of the natal household back in the village, but they aren't there. So they're kind of there in some ways and they're not there in others. And when you look at a household like this, and you start to track not just money, but the way in which production and reproduction, redistribution and care are distributed across this sort of diagram, you begin to sort of see the way in which migration is just not it's not just a story of movement, it's also a story of staying. And the stayers, the left behind, as they're, I think, slightly problematically termed, are just as important for our understanding of migration. And I suppose I heard Millie, I think. I think one of the best quotations I've come across comes from Vietnam. I mean, this is unfortunately not one of my interviewees. It's from a paper by Catherine Locke. And she quotes one of her migrants, and I think this might ring true to some of you in the room if you've interviewed people here in Nepal. She interviews a migrant in Vietnam, and this migrant says, if I would want to provide for them, my children, I have to migrate. But when I migrate, I cannot take care of them. So provision and care, production and reproduction. Yeah, and that challenge of how can you provide for your family and how can you care for them? Yeah, so that man, my second vignette, who left his wife and daughter behind, that dilemma was exactly the one that he was facing. Yeah, in order to provide for them, I have to leave. But because I leave, I can't care for them. And how you navigate that impossible, yeah, you can't do both. And of course, one of the challenges here in Nepal, and I've seen it in Laos and Vietnam and Thailand and so on, is that rural economies, rural communities cannot provide any longer. And therefore, there's a spatial separation of provision and care, of economy, of production and reproduction. And you can see, I can kind of map that back to this diagram of the household that I've got from Thailand. There are elements of provision here, and there are elements of care. How they come together, how they connect is really important. That's the sort of thing that we need to map if I would argue, if we're going to get a handle on migration. Okay. Now I want to sort of go back to Thailand. Hopefully it'll again resonate with Nepal. So this is one of those occasions when I think, right, well, what I've kind of learned over, as Suresh was saying, 41 years, isn't that? It's kind of scary, isn't it? So back to 1982 when I did my PhD. I suppose that's 40 years, isn't it? No, 41. It is 2023, yeah, you're right. In 1982, I can sort of, if you like, test those ideas against what I've seen here. So that's what I want to do for the next 10 minutes or so. So this village here at the bottom, sort of south of the road, this is the road from Gosun Pisai to Mahasarakam. It's where I did my PhD in 1982. I've been back and done panel studies, panel re-studies in 1994, 2008, and most recently last year. So I kind of go back and I talk to the household, see what's happened to them. And this photo in the inset photo was a man that we bumped into last year. We walked past the village monastery, out into the rice fields, and he was standing there. And there he is. And weirdly, 14 years before, I walked out at the same place, out into the rice fields, and there he was. Yeah. So over a 14-year period, I bumped into the same man. Yeah. Oddly wearing the same hat. I mean, you couldn't have sort of you think, how did that happen? But anyway, there he was. What's surprising in this village is that in 1982 I interviewed 81 households. When I went back in, well, you can see here, in 1994, 77 of them were still in the village, yeah, or their descendants. I could find them. In 2008, still 77. Last year, 76. You kind of think, how has that happened? Why are they still there? Why haven't they gone? I mean, Thailand's gone through the most extraordinary social and economic transformation. It's gone, in 1982 it was a low-income economy. It's now an upper-middle-income economy. Those of you, if any of you go to Bangkok, you think, whoa, yeah? So how come they're still in the village? Why haven't they left? Does this mean they're immobile? They're not. Yeah, they're juggling livelihoods across space. They're keeping, if you like, a foot in the paddy field and a foot on the factory floor. They're building livelihoods that are crossing between sectors and spaces and generations and genders in order to secure their livelihood, in a way that's not dissimilar to some of the households that we've been interviewing over the last 10 days or so. So just to give you a kind of vision of how this place has changed. So this is 1982. Here's the village in 1994. Here it is in 2008. And this is it last year. Yeah? So in visual terms, you think, my goodness, this place has been transformed beyond all. I mean, of course, I had no idea. Back in 1982, when I look at my field diaries, I mean, there's absolutely zero prescience there. No notion that just over the event horizon, Thailand would be a so-called Asian miracle that would grow and all the rest of it. So I didn't see this coming. But that's what's happened over this period of 41 years. So, how does migration sit within that process of change? And I suppose more deeply, sort of why are they still there? Why haven't the households left? And I suppose maybe why should I expect them to leave in the first place? But anyway, put that aside. So, this is migration in 1982. So essentially, the blue columns here are people in the village who are stayers, people who stay in the village, and the orange columns are people who move, whether kind of locally or a longer distance. This was a time when quite a few Thais were working in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries. I mean, not unlike Nepal now. They were going to Saudi Arabia in particular to work as contract labourers, again, not unlike Nepal now. So in a sense, I'm not suggesting that where Thailand was, Nepal will necessarily follow. I mean, of course, I've never imagined that, but there are echoes across countries, I think. So what I've got here is I've got sort of men on the left, women on the right, male on the left, female on the right, and then I've got age cohorts. And if you look at this graph, you can see that back in 1982, migration was mostly undertaken by younger villages, so it's mostly young men in particular going, a few young women, but men dominantly. They were largely peasants leaving. So if you ask them, who are they? A little bit like the second man, they would say, I'm a farmer. Yeah, and that's my identity. I don't think of myself as anything else. And it was still relatively unusual. And it was often timed to coincide with the agricultural cycle. So people would go for the off-season. This is a rain-fed area, very long dry season, pretty marginal in terms of growing wet rice, and they'd come back for the planting season in kind of May, June. Yeah, and then they would leave again at the end of the agricultural cycle. So that was the situation in 1982. And this is the sort of household that I interviewed. Very different from the earlier sort of diagram I showed. Here, everything is contained within the village. Yeah? A few people migrating out, but mostly people making a living within the confines of the village. You know, I could enter the village in 82, I could walk out into the fields, and I could have a pretty good grasp of what was going on. Yeah? The village was a container of culture, society, economy, livelihoods, you name it. Yeah? It was kind of within the boundaries of the village. And I think that's something that particularly Western scholars kind of relate to, sort of intuitively, sometimes in a slightly problematic way, but anyway, that was what I found, you know, in 1982. And these are some of the, oh, I see the script has come out strangely. Anyway, that doesn't matter. And you could then see in this village, when migration occurred, you could see the effects of migration. This house here, in the kind of left-hand side of the image, in colloquial terms, they used to be known as Ban Saud, which means Saudi house. You could go around northeast Thailand and you could spot them. Go Ban Saud, Ban, and people would talk because they were built on the back of remittances from the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia. And the first thing people did when they came back, they built a new house, and they would look like this. Yeah, and that's how they were termed. But of course, migrants also left their mark and leave their mark in cities. So these two men here, it's a photo I took in Bangkok in, I think about 1985, 86, something like that. These are very clearly peasants in the city. They're from Isan, from northeast Thailand. They eat different food, they wear different clothes, they speak a dialect of Thai. They're visible. Yeah? They take up particular types of work. In chicken slaughterhouses, in rice mills, carrying, you know, gunny bags of rice, like here in this photo. Yeah, they're within the informal sector, classic precarious lives. So this is migration in 2008, and you can kind of see what's happened. It's become much more common. It's moved up the kind of demographic profile, the age profile, and in as many women migrating as men. So this second graph kind of tells a story not just of migration changing, but in a sense, cultures of migration changing. The moral envelope of accepted practice has been opened up. Young women moving, yeah, in ways that were kind of, well, they weren't never dreamt of, but they weren't imagined quite as in the same way back in 1982. And this happens both because of migration and because of development. Yeah, so this different graph tells us something about the village, tells us something about village society, and it also tells us something about development, not just in Thailand, but internationally. Because between these two graphs, the yen appreciated against the US dollar following the Plaza Accord of 1985. Massive Japanese investment came into Thailand. They were looking for labour in footwear, electronics, textiles, and they selectively employed young women, preferably unmarried young women. And they came from villages like this one, like Ban Mon Dare. Yeah? So in a sense, what you see here in Ban Mon Dare is a result of an agreement made between Japan and the US, I'm pushing it here a little bit, made in the Plaza Hotel in New York in 1985. And the way that that then comes back to shape what happens in Ban Mon Dare. Yeah, we can make the connections. And these are the sorts of household forms that emerge as a result. And these are the migrants. So a few years ago I did a study in a export processing zone, kind of industrial estate, south of a town called Ayutthaya in central plains of Thailand. They were employing migrants from villages like Ban Mon Dare, young women like these, who were living in hopak, in dormitories. making a living, changing their lives maybe, and remitting remittances back to their natal households. Okay, now what I want to do, I'm just looking at the time. So let's say 20 to 6. Okay, maybe 10 minutes more. Okay. I now want to kind of think about how migration eras emerge. I mean, obviously migration is a kind of, we talk about it as a singular process, but it occurs in particular developmental moments. So, this is a study I did in Khon Kaen, not the one in Nong Dae, but a different one, a few years ago. And we were interested in when migrants leave, you know, if you like, the decades in which they leave and who they are and what education they had and what they worked in and that sort of thing. So these are all the migrants that we interviewed here in this graph, and you can see they date from 1974, the very earliest migrants that we managed to track, through to 2012. So that's the sort of period we're talking about. And of course, that migration, I've sort of hinted at this already, occurs against a backdrop of development. So this graph is GDP growth in Thailand from 1962, when they collected the first systematic data on things like poverty and so forth, through to around about 2012, when that particular study was done. You can see the Asian financial crisis, when the economy contracted. You can see the global financial crisis. Yeah. So this graph both kind of is the backdrop for migration, but it also explains migration explains the graph. You think about Nepal, if young men and women did not leave the villages and come to Kathmandu, or go to the Gulf or Malaysia or wherever, development in this country wouldn't look the way it does. So when young women and men leave, I mean, that's an act of real bravery. You know, when young women who have maybe never left their district decide, I need to go, I have to go, whether it's for themselves or for their families, that leap in the dark. We sometimes just imagine, maybe because most of us are quite mobile, we think, poof, easy, but it's not. So in a sense, that graph of development in Thailand was only made possible because people leave. And I think we don't sometimes reflect on what a decision that is. So, when we then looked at these two sets of migrants across time, we have a shift from, if you like, the blue shaded columns, what I call peasant sojourners. These are people who see themselves as farmers, who work often in relatively low paid, manual work, hard work in the informal sector or the semi-formal sector, and there's always the intention to go home. And they do. They often do it when they're either unmarried or recently married. And then they return. The orange bars are worker sojourners. These are people with often secondary school education. They probably have no background in farming because of the extension of childhood. When I was in 1982, they just changed compulsory education from 4 years to 6 years. To Bo Hoc, so people had to do 6 years of primary, then they raised it to 6 years of primary and 3 years of secondary, more San. And then they extended it from 6 and 3 to 6 and 6 to more Hoc, and now they're going to university. So childhood is being extended endlessly from 16 to 18 to 19 to 23, and so some of them, these young women here, would never have farmed. They would have gone to school, to primary school, to secondary school, to university, to work in the non-farm sector. And their education has been elevated as a result. So this is the sort of average education or years in education of those two groups. So what I'm saying is that in a way we need to periodize migration against the backdrop of development. And we have to also see development being made possible by migration and mobility. Okay, 5 minutes. Last sort of slightly different from that, I want to sort of now take a step back from Thailand, think more widely about how we go about migration research. And I think it's sometimes worth thinking about, a little bit like I said, maybe the problem with migration is we think we focus too much on migrants, we need to focus on non-migrants. But also we need to maybe use different methods. We need to frame things differently. And I want to sort of briefly reflect on some of those issues. So, first, as I've said, maybe we need to focus on non-migrants if we want to understand migration. Secondly, and I've said this as well, we need to focus on reproduction, and just not on production. We need to value the effectual as well as the affectual. So not just the material, but also the emotional. So what happens when people leave? When people leave to work, they don't just send money back. They create emotional impacts in the source communities, which often just get ignored, overlooked. Yeah? Partly because they're hard to measure, they're hard to see, but also because we don't count them. We don't think they're important. Yeah? So I think we need to ask and think about sort of why we privilege certain things and not others. I think we have to stop viewing policies as background noise. Yeah? The policies that are put in place, yeah, really matter. You know, sort of whether we decide, I mean at the moment, I don't know if it's true, but everyone we've spoken to over the last 10 days, even if they have reasonable areas of land, cannot make a decent living from farming. Yeah? Why is it that farm-non-farm relations are such that there's a kind of urban bias? That in order to make a living you have to leave. There's a kind of policy decision there that needs thinking about. And I also think we need to kind of, I guess, get away from the view that we can all make our own futures, that anything's possible. I think sometimes we're constrained by circumstance. We're held down by history. And we can't make the future that we would like. And sometimes I think that idea that, you know, to release people to move around, we have to reduce barriers to migration. I think the impossibility of actually taking up those opportunities needs to be recognised. And then I think academically, we've got to think about the concepts we use. There's a lovely book by Timothy Mitchell called Rule of Experts, which maybe some of you have read, and it's on Egypt, mostly. And he has this quote that I've got here. Fields of analysis often develop a convention for introducing their object, in this case, migration. Such tropes come to be seen as too obvious and straightforward to question. Objects of analysis do not occur as natural phenomena, but are partly formed by the discourse that describes them. The more natural the object appears, the less obvious this discursive manufacture will be. So in other words, we've got to sort of think, why is migration and migration studies emerged in the way that it has? Yeah, what are the assumptions that we have kind of built into that? Right, do I want to do this? Right, well, I'm going to skip this bit. I'm going to go on to the final section. So, last section, then I'll be roughly on time. So with that in mind, what's our entry point? When we go, so this picture I took 2 days ago, I think it was, in Dhoka. Wonderful, rice just about ready for harvest, fantastic, beautiful view. There it is, looking down the valley in Dhoka. So how do we understand migration in a place like this, in this photo? Do we think of it in terms of the national economy, so Nepal's economy, in terms of the rural space that you can see here, in terms of agriculture, in terms of the communities and the settlements that are kind of behind me when I took this photo, or the individual households and families that make up those communities, or those places that we call communities, or maybe the individuals that comprise the families and the households. Yeah, so what's our point of reference when we're thinking about migration? So I just quickly go through it. I mean, if you think of migration in national terms here in Nepal, migration makes Nepal richer in economic terms, in GDP terms. I mean, what is it, 25%, 30% of GDP comes from remittances, yeah? I mean, that's phenomenal. If it wasn't for all those tens of thousands of men and women who leave Nepal, yeah? I took this earlier today outside, Patan Gate. If you like, the infrastructure of Kathmandu wouldn't look at the way it does. Yeah, so from a national point of view, we render migration visible in certain ways. What about rural spaces? I mean, this is a photo I showed before. This is the corner of Banon there. The road comes out, and this is what you see, a 7-Eleven open 24/7. Yeah, that's made possible by migration, because people have money to spend in shops. Infrastructure arrives, roads are improved, taxi services, yeah? So if you like, rural development is part and parcel tied to the money that is generated from migration that creates an economic landscape that allows these sorts of amenities to emerge. But then also in Dhoka, when we were there, and you'll be more familiar with this than I am, all of the idle land, unused terraces, because there isn't the labour to farm them. So what is good for rural development is not necessarily good for agriculture. So if we take an agricultural view, a farming view of migration, we get disintensification. We get the abandonment of land. Yeah, we get forest encroaching on formerly forested land, animals becoming pests because they're beginning to eat the harvest. Yeah? So from a farming point of view, migration creates these sorts of problems. In Indonesia, I had a PhD student who worked in Indonesia. They have two lovely words for land like this. They either call it tidur, sleeping, or they call it gosong, abandoned. Yeah? So is this sleeping land, or is this abandoned land? Is this tidur, or is it gosong? What about the communities? This is a photo I took in Thanh Hoa in Vietnam. We interviewed people in Hanoi, and then we went back to their source communities. Empty farmsteads, hollowed out communities, villages bereft of the vitality of youth because they're not there. Yeah, like the young woman we interviewed a few days ago. What about the households, where you've got elderly alone, you've got satellite parenting and left behind children? Yeah. How do we kind of assess that? And then you've got the individual level. This is a picture of a migrant worker that I took in Singapore, where I parked my bike every morning when I went to work. And there he was. This is, in Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani would say that there are no poor people, because men like this don't count. Yeah, they're not part of the data set. So for him as an individual, is this a liberating process of movement? Is this bestowing cumulative benefits on his household back in India? Yep, so from an individual point of view, to think about migration. So the point about all this is, what are we actually looking at? National economy, rural development, agriculture, farming, individual, community, household. And where we look, to some extent, determines the answers we arrive at. So, last thing to say, and I've put here, here's the thing. what else can I do? I mean, so often people say that. When you say, why do you migrate? That's the answer you get. Well, what else can I do? I have no choice. There's no opportunity here. I can't feed my family from my land. If I want to build a better future for myself, I need to leave. So time and again, there's this sense of there is no alternative. So having kind of I don't know about critique migration, but at least raised questions about migration, you come back to this really uncomfortable fact that actually there isn't much choice for many people. There's a necessity to leave. And the final slide is this one. This is a poster from Laos. The Lao over the top says the route to a new life, and on the left it says Bachuban, which means today, and then there's the future. And on the left-hand side you've got people living in the hills. They are isolated from the mainstream, cut off from development, maybe a little bit like some places in Nepal. And the government's encouraging people to come down from the hills to resettle in villages not unlike the first photo I showed right at the start of the presentation. And the assumption is you can then deliver development. And you see here electricity, clean water, sanitation, health, diet, education, and so on. Yeah? That these things get delivered because people move to the resettlement villages. But those villages, like the one we were at in Dhoka, it doesn't stop migration from occurring. Yeah? People still leave because kind of what else can they do but leave? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's wonderful, such a nuanced approach to look into the question of migration and development. We have now 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A, and I'm sure many of you have questions, probably many questions, but as a rule, I must repeat it again, like please make your questions very precise, one question at a time, and if you want to share your reflections, comments, please try to make it briefer within 2 to 3 minutes so that many of us can participate and get more insights from Jonathan. That is a request as well as rule of the hall, I would say. Probably I may have some questions, but I just open the floor for the question and answer. So what would you prefer, like one-on-one, or we just collect 3 or 4 questions and then you respond to questions?
It could be 2 or 3, then of course if I can't answer one, I can choose one of the other ones. But maybe take 2 or 3.
Okay, that's great.
And do it like that. I mean, if there are, anyway.
Yeah, sure. There is a mic around, and then please raise your hand. And just said, yeah, Alaji. 1, 2, first here.
It was a very, Professor, it was a very comprehensive, really comprehensive presentation. I myself do not have even elementary knowledge of migration because I was trained in something else. I was a teacher and was trained in teaching. So my questions may be very elementary type. Starting from what else can I do? You know, in Nepal, students who have got through 10+2, which is higher secondary education, already make their mind up to go either Australia or Canada or UK or USA. I think this is the type of people you categorize as worker sojourners. I'm wondering if you have come across some research in Thailand or other countries as regards this phenomena. I mean, why students right from primary education level start to consider going or following their elders to these countries. This basically, I think you understand my basic
Yes.
point. Yeah, thank you.
Next. On the right, and then Abbas.
Hi, very such.
Could you please also identify yourself so that it will be here?
I'm Shoaib. I'm doing my postdoc here at the South Asia Institute of Advanced Studies. So very thought-provoking content. And I would actually want to challenge your central proposition that people migrate for these economic freedoms. And the focus on those who are stayed behind has us looking at these care dynamics of care, dimensions of care. So one of the articles that I and Rohit wrote called Contoured Urbanism, we observed that people migrate for care, especially in, so we come from Western Himalayas, the Kullu Himalayan region. So people shift and migrate from villages to small towns so that they can educate their children. And so, despite having thriving orchard economies in rural areas, they would come down, and thus, so they still, I think, what you talked about, keeping a speculative foothold in multiple places, that is so much at the essence of it, but they would keep a speculative foothold in both rural as well as small towns. And it makes things challenging. I had narratives where families actually preferred living in the villages, but they wanted to live in the town, in dense neighborhoods, just so that they can educate their children. And so, on that very note, if you were to, I think, if you were to not think about having to migrate as a necessity to migrate, what else can we do? In some ways, migration is also very central to our lives, to all of our lives, in our pursuits of finding our ability to care, what to care about, how to care about it. So yeah,
Thank you. Thank you. Abbas. Yeah, please. Abbas, and then.
I'm Abbas. I'm a student of anthropology. It's a very interesting topic and resonates a lot with migration issues in Nepal. Just something that you talked about in terms of trying to shift our focus from migrants, perhaps to say those left behind, and I think you hinted as well how perhaps the concept of left behind could equally be a bit problematic in the way that we tend to look at these binaries of those who are able to move and those who are not able to move, and perhaps there is a much more fluid understanding of what these categories can be. So maybe if you could lighten up on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Abbas. And the fourth one, please.
Good evening. This is Subin Kesi from Central Department of Economics, TU. I'm a master's student. So my question is a bit of counterfactual type. So would development be there if the migration leads to migration and it leads to further migration? Just like if in one of the household, in one member of the household, he migrates to any other destination, and then with the income there, he shifts his family from original place to another place. So would there be the persistence of the development that your title and your paper want to convey? Thank you.
Thank you. So we stop here, and then we have 4 questions, 4 interesting questions. And in the meantime, while Jonathan is answering to responding to your questions, please prepare your next questions.
Yeah, great. All excellent questions. I'll do them back to front. So start maybe with in fact, both the third and the fourth question. So the one about the left behind, and then the one about how migration kind of permits further migration and movement. So that, I mean, left behind, I mean, the reason why I kind of said, slightly throwaway remark, but that it's slightly unfortunate, it's because left behind, it has sort of pejorative undertones, doesn't it? You know, oh, they're forgotten about, they're not, but they're not forgotten about. I mean, that was kind of getting at. They're part of the equation. Yeah, they're not sort of just sort of hidden under a table somewhere, being ignored and overlooked and so on. They're actually, it's because people are left behind that other people can move. Yeah. So in that sense, that's why I sort of was saying maybe that's in a way we need to come up with some other term that doesn't have those undertones. And then linking both the third and the fourth question, there's been some really interesting work on what's known as serial migration by, in particular, well, the scholar that springs to mind is Brenda Yo. So serial migration, that if you like, one generation's migration makes the next generation's migration inevitable. It never solves the problem, if you like. I mean, you know, there's a vision that, well, I'm going to leave and I'm going to make, you know, a few, you know, lakhs of rupees or dollars or whatever it is, or yeah, and then I'm going to come back and everything's going to be fine and I'm not going to have to move again. But actually what happens is it then becomes embedded intergenerationally. The children of migrants become migrants themselves. Yeah? So in that sense, you know, it becomes a serial enterprise. And in a sense, the conditions which cause migration to occur in the first place are not solved by migration. If anything, they just get reproduced. Yeah? So you come back, you build a new house or whatever, but then you have to go again to pay the fees for your children going to university or whatever it is. Or then your children get married and they want a house, so you go again. So I mean, if you look at, say, the Philippines, I mean, some really nice work in the Philippines on migration, where what were termed dutiful daughters, you know, women, unmarried women leaving for the sake of the family, then become what are termed martyr mothers. They then have children themselves, but then they have to go as mothers, and then they become remote parents, and you can see them in Singapore, where I used to live. If you go to the centre of Singapore, you see Filipino mothers on their phones doing homework with their children back in the Philippines. Yeah? So, and then those children will become migrants. So I think there's something, there's a kind of intergenerational kind of, you know, ineluctable logic that connects up generations because of migration. So yeah, I think, you know, that notions of serial migration, which I've never studied myself, I kind of sense, yeah, I can see how that happens. Then the second question, yeah, I mean, I think, education, it's just amazing how it crops up, doesn't it? I mean, it's always, you know, that the reason to leave, I mean, that first, was it the first one? Yeah, the first vignette, that young woman who was studying for a BBA, yeah, and I mean, I didn't realise this until this week. You know, if you like, the whole teaching day is organised around the fact that people have to work. So, as I understand it, you know, they work during the day and they study in the evening. So the whole, you know, private sector sort of educational context here is geared around the notion that people are coming into Kathmandu, and so education is extraordinary. I mean, there's a really nice study from a long time ago by Hefner that talks about education being the golden plough that can transform your life. Yeah, that if you don't have education, well, it comes back, you know, what can I do? Yeah, well, you can do some things, but there are certainly some things you can't do. And so education becomes absolutely key. And I think the difference, you know, well, kind of in Asia, the way that, well, that, if you like, migrating for the sake of the family, and accumulating education for the sake of the family. A household we interviewed in Hanoi about 10 years ago now, they'd come in from rural areas, they were living in a one-room kind of shack, and the whole household was there selling sandals from the back of a bicycle. And all of the income was being used to send one of the daughters to study accountancy at university. So the whole family was working so that she could go to university. And the kind of unspoken, I don't know if you want to call it a bargain, was that, of course, when she leaves university and gets a good job, it'll, yeah, that success will then ripple through to the rest of the family. So yeah, I mean, education, absolutely central. And maybe that didn't come through. Yes, and the first question, it kind of links into the golden plough argument as well. I mean, you said you were a teacher. I mean, you know, honourable, absolutely valuable thing to do. So you have as much right to ask these questions as people like me. But yeah, you were saying people going to Australia, the USA. I think Mukta, who's here, I think somewhere. Yes, you were saying there's this sort of I don't know if Mukta's right. He may be wrong, and you can mug him afterwards. But there's a sort of rank order. You know, there are countries like Canada and the UK and the USA and Australia, maybe not the UK actually, USA at the top. Yeah, and then you work your way down a list, a rank order, in terms of the countries that are desirable. But those countries, like Australia, the USA, you can move to permanently. I mean, Singapore you can't.
No.
Yeah, Singapore makes pretty sure that no migrants ever become citizens. So, I mean, if you're a domestic worker in Singapore, you have a pregnancy test before you arrive. You have to, if you get pregnant, you have to leave the country. You cannot have a child in Singapore because they do not wish migrants to become nationals of the country. And I think something similar in the Gulf and so on. So I think there's a really important qualitative difference between those countries and the others. You know, some are places which you can embed yourself in long term. You become citizens of those countries, you can settle, and maybe you can bring your family along later. But other countries are just for work, and of course you leave your family behind, and you can never bring them to join you. So I think there's a big difference there between those.
Thank you. So we take another sets of questions, like 3 to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, Kendra. We have noticed hands, right? Raise your hands. Please.
Hi. Marielle from working at IMI, the Water Management Institute. So I'm not at all a specialist of migration, but obviously when you're working about migration is a big topic. I guess I wanted to maybe be a bit provocative. I wasn't quite sure what the point you were trying to make, actually. Is it a good thing or a bad thing, migration, or is it up to us to make our minds? But, you know, in your list at the end where you say it depends how you look at migration, if you look at it from agriculture point of view or from economic development point of view, etc., we have different outcomes. But one thing that strikes me, and I don't know if you agree with that, but in your presentation, it sounded to me like you're sort of saying that development is happening or has happened because people have migrated, or people are migrated because they are seeking development. So it's a bit the chicken and egg thing, right? But I wanted whether on your list of agriculture, etc., you couldn't ask also add inequality. If we look at migration from an inequality perspective, we would see very different things. Because it seems to me like, as you also said at the beginning, that migration, if it's such a great thing, why are we not facilitating it? And I believe that the Nepali government is facilitating migration in a big way. And there is a whole policy of exporting labor for the development of the country. And I'm wondering to what extent the elite, the Nepali elite, who also export their own children, but they export their children to the US and Canada, whilst the poor Nepali export their children to the Gulf and to much more difficult countries. So I'm wondering whether there isn't also like an elite-driven type of using labor in a very, exploitative manner to develop the country so that the elite doesn't have to share its own resources and actually also contribute to development of the country.
Thank you.
I'm Meeta, and I'm also affiliated with the South Asia Institute for Advanced Studies. I did enjoy the different perspectives that you gave us. I did have a few comments that I wanted to make. So when you talk about being left behind, I was thinking, who is the one that is actually being left behind? Because when one person in the family migrates, in most cases the men, then the spouse and the children often move to peri-urban or urban areas, and it's the elderly who gets left behind. That's what we've been seeing in a lot of different villages. Secondly, when these days migrants are going further and further away, so there's no coming back for seasonal labor, working the fields. And yes, the fields are being abandoned because there's less labor. But then, like I said, the migrants are going further and further away, so there's less opportunity for them to come back, even though they still identify themselves as farmers. The third thing is, I put the question back to you. What do we do then? Coming from a development background, what else do we do? How do we get the services up to these remote mountain areas? The water, the electricity, the roads. If we're not able to do that, are we going to then ask the people to come down to where we can provide it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I only have one question. When does somebody stop being a migrant? I know many Nepalis have citizens of other countries, but they come back. And some become citizens of another country and don't come back. But is that an internal kind of question that people ask themselves? Or is it a description that other people give to other people?
Professor Rigg, hi again. I'm Rachna, I'm also from Bristol University. More of a question, it's on observation on your presentation. In Nepal, studying migration, I think migration is often guises itself, it's a benign euphemism for forced displacement. I say that because I come from a disaster and climate change background, and I think that aspect was missing in the presentation altogether. So that's just a quick observation. Thank you.
Thank you. So we just have another round of questions in the next sessions. So, yeah.
Okay. I'll make them brief. Okay, answers. Maybe I'll do it in the order that they were asked this time. IMI question. So I've done some work with Diana Suhardaman, who used to be in Vientiane with IMI. I suppose what I was trying to argue is that where I kind of started, that actually, if we're going to understand migration, we have to see it against. It's a development question, not a migration question. I suppose that's what I was trying to say in terms of the sort of underpinning sort of flow of the talk. Chicken or egg, absolutely, yeah. So the graph of growth, that wouldn't have happened if people didn't leave. But of course, people leave because of the graph, if you like. And those two things occur in tandem. They sort of feed off each other. The inequality, I mean, you probably didn't see, but one of the earlier slides, I had a quote from John Connell from, I think, 1976, working on India, where he says, migration is, both the father of inequality and, and begets further inequality. Yeah, that is, so migration occurs, well, there's distress migration, the poor leave, and there's migration for accumulation, and both those movements are occurring, but the underpinning kind of logic is obviously very different. And if you like, elite migration has a very different background to it than migration by the poorest, who are going for very different reasons, with different outcomes, for different places, for different levels of return, and so forth. And the question about who is left behind. well, I mean, here it's mostly men, but if you go to the Philippines, it's mostly men who migrate. You go to the Philippines, in some areas, it's mostly women who migrate. I mean, if you go to Vietnam, it's pretty balanced. If you go to Thailand, it depends which era you're looking at. So, I mean, here, of course, there's a tendency to assume that, most migrants are men, and that has certain impacts in terms of, the feminization of agriculture debate and that sort of thing. But in other countries, it's very different. So, it's not always like it is here, and that's important. And who's left behind? I mean, sometimes it's the elderly. I mean, if you look at Vietnam and China, the household registration system stops people moving to cities, or at least it constrains it significantly. So the rest of the family are left behind in the source community. So the household registration, I mean, in China, there were, I think, 40 million left behind children. I mean, just staggering numbers, yeah? So their movement of the rest of the family is very sharply constrained. So the hukou system doesn't allow you to send your children to school in an urban context unless you get urban registration, and that's very hard to do. It's changing a bit now. So who can move, why, and what, who's left behind, it's different, yeah. And then when do you stop being a migrant? The third question. I mean, I suppose that comes back to the point about the Philippines when I was talking about the dutiful daughters becoming the migrant, the martyr mothers, that, people think it's a one-off. Well, if you interview them, they say, well, I'm just going to go once, and then they go a second time. So, yeah, the future, of course, who knows what's going to happen. But I think it does keep going on. It keeps recurring. It doesn't stop. It gets passed from generation to generation. And because it almost reproduces itself. One era's migration begets the circumstances where the next generation needs to go. And then the forced displacement. Yeah, I mean, I've never, well, except in Laos. I worked on forced resettlement in Laos, which is this poster, actually, here. So this was the poster, designed by the government to encourage people being displaced as a result of a hydropower plant in Laos, trying to tell them that moving is a good thing. Yeah, that if you want the benefits of development, you need to move. So this is, but I mean, I know in the case of Nepal, I've talked about forced displacement here. I mean, in the scheme of things, I have to be careful. I mean, in terms of numbers, there are about 750 million migrants, yeah, across the world. People moving around, working one place, moving from living in one place and living in the other. So it's a very large number. The proportion of those who are forced migrants, I would have thought is, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of studying them, it's comparatively small. Yeah, so I think that of that 750 million, they're mostly, well, voluntary in the sense that they don't have to. But it comes back to that final slide, kind of sort of what else can I do? I mean, I think some of them would say, well, in a sense it is forced, because if I'm going to secure my or my children's future, there's a need to move. I think I've covered all of it. I'm being a bit quicker.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we take another round of questions, the last round of questions. So I can see two hands. I think that will be 3 hands. Okay, we have altogether 3 hands raised. So I think these 3 hands should be sufficient for the last round because we're also running out of time. So I request you to ask very direct, straight questions without any background. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm Sanjeet from the Center of Labour and Mobility Social Science, Baha. So it was a very relevant and necessary presentation. I addressed somewhere that, if a doctor from Sudan migrates to the United Kingdom and becomes a taxi driver, the global GDP goes up, but obviously the implications for Sudan and for the migrant are quite complex. But what I would like to ask you is, because you are linking migration with development, so how do you conceptualize development in your approach? Because if we look at things from beyond a neoliberal perspective, so many would say that migration is not only an indicator or a consequence of development, but it is development itself. So you cited Amartya Sen in the presentation, and that's what he would say. So how would you conceptualize development in your approach? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jivan, again from Center for the Study of Labor and Mobility, Social Science Lab. First of all, thank you, Jonathan, for that insightful presentation. As a student of migration, and then again, listening to your presentation, I was wondering about the relationship between the graph that you showed and the migration. When we talk about the graph, are you also considering the global kind of development? Because the pull factor and the push factor that we've been talking about, or the development that corrects the conditions that in the very place led to some kind of migration, has some kind of implications. So I think there is some linkage between global development, global governance, and this interdependent economy. So if you could reflect on that point.
Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing your fieldwork and your insights. I actually had a question that was exactly the same as the first question, but just kind of add on to it. I do agree that development and migration are inextricably linked, but I suppose, just kind of asking that question about what you define development to be, and then just to kind of add on to that, because I've kind of read studies and done a bit of my own research in terms of how when women migrants migrate, like Nepali women migrants migrate, yes, they migrate for economic reasons, but they also migrate to care for their families, like you said, but also care for themselves. So a lot of the interviews I did talked about how they're moving away from these communities where they had a lot of traditional norms imposed on them, and they felt quite empowered and like they had a sense of autonomy to themselves. So do you kind of include caring for not just families but themselves as a part of development, or have you kind of thought about that, and what are your opinions on that? Thank you.
Okay, could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, I'm Milana. I'm from the development background, so actually the UN. So when you were citing UNDP, but I just graduated in July, so I still consider myself an academic background as well.
Thank you. Last chance, for the last question, if there is. Thank you.
Right, I'll be quick. Boy, big questions to end with. How do I conceptualize development? I've kind of often, with my students, we teach courses on this, and I've got a minute. I guess Robert Chambers, a long time ago, said for him, development is good change. And actually, as a kind of throwaway kind of encapsulation, that's what we're aiming to do. Yeah? How do we promote good change? And I think, if we've only got 5 seconds, that's probably a good definition. I don't think migration is constitutive of development in the Amartya Sen sense. So the first question. I would dispute that. I don't think when Amartya Sen asked that question, what is constitutive of development? I'm not sure if migration is in there. But anyway, we can obviously talk about that. This graph, and it'd be nice, wouldn't it, if I was sufficiently kind of au fait with, but if I could pick out of this graph, what is the, if you like, the migration component, and how does the graph feed back? Maybe there are ways of doing that which I'm unaware of, but I'm sure it's in there. And when thinking about Thailand, and Vietnam for that matter, you know, when export-oriented factories began to locate in those countries in very large numbers, requiring a particular type of worker, yeah, who were mostly living in rural areas, and the factories were mostly in peri-urban areas, there's a requirement to migrate, yeah, and of course those factories then generated the growth, the foreign exchange and so on, which drove development. So I mean, you can see how the two are connected. What the degree of the connection is, I mean, I don't know, I'd love to be able to work it out, but I mean, certainly I'm absolutely sure that there is a connection between the two, and teasing out the connection, how it works, needs to be part of that. I mean, your question, there's some really nice work by a scholar called Becky Elmhurst, who did her PhD in Lampung in southern Sumatra, staunchly Islamic part of Indonesia. And when she did her PhD, which I examined a long time ago, young women were not meant to go outside even the kind of confines of the household without being chaperoned. Yeah, it was deeply unseemly for them to leave, to go into the fields without a man, you know, unmarried women, without a man from the family with them. And then when Becky went back, she found that almost every young woman had left the village and had gone to Tangerang on the outskirts of Jakarta to work. And she talked to the head, I think I got this right, to say, what's going on? You know, I was here, you know, living with you a year ago, and they've all gone off. You told me they couldn't, they've gone to Tangerang. How do you explain it? And he said, there is no shame in what cannot be seen. So, you know, migration changes things. Yeah, it reworks norms and practices, which then become kind of justified. And what happened in the village that Becky worked in is that notions of femininity changed. What made an adequate or a desirable marriage partner changed. What you were looking for. Suddenly households, to begin with, they assumed these young women out of the household. They weren't expected to remit money. But then heads of households suddenly thought, whoa, they're earning lots of money. I'm going to have some of that. And then it changed. There was the expectation that they remitted money back to the household. Yeah, so it's never a moment, you know, you track migration over time, and things, I mean, just extraordinary change happens as a result. Yeah. So yes, it does. I mean, there's some really profound changes in culture and society that occurs because of migration. And of course, because they change, that then also, I mean, I'm kind of saying obvious stuff here, that migration changes as a result. But I mean, often when I go back and look at my field diaries, in retrospect, I kind of get things wrong. I never see stuff which is just over the event horizon. I don't see it coming. And what seems so obvious in retrospect, yeah, I suppose we have lots of hindsight, very little foresight, and migration is part of that, that dilemma, I think.
Finally, thank you, Jonathan. It was a very interesting presentation and very interesting, very interactive kind of Q&A sessions. So I would also like to thank you for your very thought-provoking questions. So since we don't have time to left for the discussions, but since many of us inside this room are also researchers on migration, so some of the questions that we actually could not ask or drill more, even though he actually touched upon in his presentations. One is like, for example, in the station case, very much resonates with the Nepali cases or experiences as well. So, but there is a very strong interventions there or interfering variables, that is caste. So how do you actually look into, or how we actually differentiate between the East Asian experiences and Nepali experience, where caste is so strong intervening factors? So how to deal with this class and caste conundrum in this case? That could be one questions to basically to frame the research questions. Another is like, for example, in somewhere, since you have done a lot of studies on the small holders, farmers. So, if I'm not wrong, so for example, if the smallholders actually they step back and do their agriculture, they can hardly survive. for them actually the only way to accumulate capital is to migrate, so that they can actually uplift their, let's say, they can enter into the middle class or so. So that is another questions. Like for example, it's very tricky and complicated questions in terms in case of Nepal or in the context of Nepal. And then third is like, for example, even if you actually talked much about, like, for example, I mean, very clearly that migration and development, right? So there is no kind of, let's say, migration and development appears to be very neutral kind of term. So you have to ask whose migrations, who migrating, who are left behind, and whose development and what development. So these are some of the things. But again, I mean, we were talking in a more economistic sense. So in case of Nepal, in the context of Nepal, I think that's true in the South Asian, East Asian country also. Like, for example, migration is also very prominent, social and political questions at this moment. So how to integrate that into the migration issues? So there can be many other open questions that we can discuss further in the days to come. And once again, thank you, Jonathan, for your very wonderful presentations, and thank you, wonderful audiences. And on behalf of Social Science Baha, please join me, giving this gift to Professor Jonathan. Thank you.